Hello and welcome back to the Eyes of O Gaming channel for another game review. This one is definitely one that I've been looking forward to getting into, as I've previously covered the first two games in the series, but today we're looking at Metro Exodus, a game which originally released back in 2019, being published by Deep Silver, a company that I'm sure many people are going to be familiar with, and developed by 4A Games, who have mostly been involved with Metro, but the people working for them have previously made up the core of the development team behind Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl. So what exactly is Metro Exodus? How does it compare to previous entries in the franchise? And more importantly, is it still worth it for the first-time player to pick up and give it a try? Well, hopefully I can help you answer those questions for yourself as we take a look at Metro Exodus. Let's get into it. So how can I go about setting this one up for you? Well, as always with sequels, although I do try to keep major story spoilers out, I'm going to assume that you're either familiar with the previous entries in the series, or at least don't mind story spoilers for those games. If you prefer to start with the earlier releases, I have covered both Metro and Metro Last Light, and I'll make sure that there's links to them in the description or popping up on your screen somewhere. They're going to be around. So Metro Exodus takes place in the year 2035 and will be 1 year after the end of Metro Last Light. If you haven't played the games which came out prior to this, the short version is that they take place in a post-apocalyptic world which has been destroyed by nuclear warfare. The games are mainly going to take place in Russia, but do also include some areas outside but in the former Soviet Union territories. Now, although they did have brief excursions to the surface in the first two games, they were focused mostly on the metro tunnels and life within them. This is going to be a little bit of a spoiler for early on in the game, but should be rather obvious given the title. This entry features an exodus from the tunnels, and will have a much greater focus on the surface world. So basically, if you're coming into this fresh with Metro Exodus, it's a game set in a nuclear wasteland following a fictional Great War, which occurred in 2013. The big difference setting this one apart from other standard post-apocalyptic games is that Metro has some supernatural aspects to it, making the series fit within the horror genre as well. As with all sequels, the obvious comparison is to go back to earlier releases, and this one is no different. It has elements from the first game, which were then built upon by Last Light, and then further fleshed out in Metro Exodus. The first game was more focused on stealth within the tunnels, and the cramped areas and trying to get around in them. Of course, this was also present in Last Light, but I felt like they fleshed out and made the surface excursions a little bit more interesting in that one. And then now we get to Exodus, which has a much more expanded surface area to explore. But you're also going to have sections of the game which take place in tunnels as well, so you get a lot more of that varied experience than either of the first two. This is just going to be some personal opinion, but I felt that Metro 2033 was more combat focused and Last Light was more story focused, though still with plenty of combat to go around, of course. In Exodus we have a really good balance of the two, with a lot of story woven in between combat sections. Aside from the previous games in the series, we can also compare this one to the Stalker games. There's obviously going to be some differences in terms of gameplay, but the world building and aesthetics will have much in common with each other. Another game I'm going to bring up is Mad Max, though this one is mostly just due to the open world wasteland experience. There are vehicles in Metro Exodus, but it won't be such a central concept as was in Mad Max. Also, although you are free to explore in the world in Metro Exodus, it's not a typical open world like Mad Max was. Basically, you're just going to be traveling to different zones, and you're limited to that zone that you're in at the time. And moving to new zones as the story progresses along means that you're going to be leaving the old zones without a way to go back to them. Lastly, I just want to bring up the Wolfenstein franchise. The only reason why I'm making any comparison to this is because it's another series which is built on a shooter game, but with the emphasis on the story and interaction between characters. Most shooters to me kind of feel like the Michael Bay of games, just a bunch of noise and action so that you can have a fun time turning off your brain and killing some time in them. These shooters are different. The main thing they want to do is tell a story, and the medium that they do it in just happens to be a shooter game. There's a lot of similar mechanics to the previous games. It's going to be a first-person perspective game with a heavy combat focus. And there's also a return of customization of weapons, the use of medkits, as well as the gas mask in toxic zones. Of course, with the need to replace the filter as in previous releases. In Metro Exodus, the customization has gotten expanded on, and you can do some crafting while on the go, or at specific workbenches. You also need to clean weapons at workbenches, as they become dirty with their use and their overall stats will be debuffed. There's going to be some vehicles in the game, land vehicles as well as rowboats and zip lines. Since the game is taking place mostly outside of the metro tunnels, the time of day and the weather will affect the world and the NPCs in it. This can change how you approach exploration or taking on side missions while exploring. The side missions are also going to play a larger role this time around. Basically, you'll be moving from one particular zone of importance to another as you progress through the story. Don't worry though, it's going to be made obvious to you as you progress that you're going to be moving on to a new zone. But while you're currently in a zone, you can explore and do objectives for both the main story and many side missions and stories. These side missions can be things like freeing some people who are taken prisoner, or maybe wiping out a bandit camp, to name a couple of different things. You're going to be taking on monsters or mutants, as well as humans such as bandits, with monsters basically having you burn through your ammunition, and other humans being much more profitable when you loot them and their camps. You can also use the weather or time of day to your advantage as well, and if the conditions aren't as you want, you can always find a safe house area to rest and advance the time so it'll be more advantageous to you. The graphics are definitely going to feel boosted from previous releases. I played through the re-releases of Metro 2033 and Last Light, and in my opinion, Exodus is still a good jump ahead of these versions. Aside from just the overall quality, the game has much more variation than the previous releases. Metro 2033 was mostly within the Metro system, which made sense for what they were going for, but Last Light actually opened things up more with some more surface exploration. This one takes things in another direction by incorporating the best of both those games, but while also adding in a bunch of other locations to change things up. So you have your standard metro tunnels, surface urban areas, but you're also going to have deserts, ports, swampy areas, frigid frozen zones, forested. There's just a lot more to see in this one than previously. You can see on screen how it looks and make up your own mind, of course, but in my opinion the graphics are really quite good and hold up well today. So what actually makes this one different? Well, there is a lot of open areas to explore, unlike previous Metro games. So what I mean by that is, although exploration has always been a key aspect, in the previous games you were following a very specific path as you played through. And for exploration, it was usually check a room or some area off to the side, an old hallway, something like that. In this one, you arrive at a zone and the exploration is left much more up to the player. You've got your overall objective, but for the most part you're free to tackle it at your leisure, exploring and completing side objectives as you go, and of course before dealing with the main task. Another big change from previous releases is the focus on the human element. So Metro has always had strong storytelling, but it was typically tied more directly to the supernatural elements. I found that this time around the focus is more on human struggles and survival in the post-apocalyptic world, as well as the relationships between those involved in it. Scavenging feels a little bit more important now. Instead of just trying to find ammo or something quest specific, you're going to be looking for other things as you travel around, and it feels a lot more dynamic and less gamey. As with other Metro games, this one is going to focus on atmosphere and immersion, as well as storytelling through the environment. You have your scarcity and resource management as well, which is something that I find is very different from most shooters, which just keep giving you ammo everywhere. In this franchise, you need to keep an eye on what you're using and what you have left. This is a post-apocalyptic survival game after all, so it all makes sense. Aside from that, the day-night cycle and how it affects your choices with how you might approach a mission or exploration And the weapon and equipment upgrades, which is a key component of Metro games, are both going to feel like pretty unique elements and keep this from feeling like just any other shooter game out there. I didn't really run into any bugs. I'm not saying that they don't exist, but personally not something that affected my experience. One thing that I will say, which has been a consistent comment I've made about all the Metro games, is that the movement feels a lot stiffer than most shooters. It's going to feel slower and reaction time seems a little bit more delayed than other shooter games. I really can't tell if this is intentional or just a quirk, but it is noticeable and different from the more fluid movement of contemporary shooters, and now even more so when compared to newer game releases. This could very well all be an attempt at immersion, and it's not terrible, it just takes some getting used to if you're not familiar with it. I think the sound overall, in my opinion, is pretty good, at least in terms of the ambient sounds, environmental noise, and that kind of thing. One comment that I've always made about Metro games is that some of the dialogue can feel a little awkward, and I'm not sure if that word is the best description of what I mean, but there's just some odd word choices or phrases in certain places. I'm pretty sure this is probably just due to translations, and possibly if you play in a different language like Russian or Ukrainian, this just isn't the case. But it does exist in the English version, which is what I played. I do want to mention though that this awkwardness that I'm talking about, it's been greatly reduced when you compare it to the first game or even to Last Light. It's not something that took me out of the game, it's just something I wanted to know. Anyway, I'll play some examples of the audio here for you so you can decide for yourself how you feel about it.
There he is, people! Just don't shoot, please. I've no quarrel with you.
Are there any single women in that place?
Great reaction. So I think the moment calls for... Bring it out to me.
Bring what out, Colonel? Sir?
That thing that's been sloshing about in your canteen. You think I'm deaf or what?
That. Just a moment. I thought my ears were deceiving me.
It's not a short trip to the Urals, so we should make ourselves comfortable, I guess. Let's name this bucket of bolts at the very least, eh?
It's about time.
Let's call her Anna and be done with it.
Nah, go to hell.
I noticed you. Covering.
So with all the general concepts of what the game is for people interested in that, let's get into the opinions and subjective territory. I'm going to keep this really short, but I just want to mention a couple things. If you've seen some of the other reviews on the channel, you should know the deal by now, but for new people, don't expect a number rating or something like that because I don't believe in them. The entire point of my reviews is more just to show you the game and let you decide for yourself, because not everyone is going to enjoy every game, and your experience is going to be subjective and personal. That said, now that I've gone over the game in general, I'm just going to give a bit of my own experience for those that are interested, but keep in mind that whether I enjoyed the game or not, it doesn't mean that you will or won't. And you should instead base your decision on whether or not to give it a try based on the breakdown in the first part of the review. Okay, so did I enjoy Metro Exodus?
'I love it.
Yes, very much so. This was by far my favorite in the series. I did enjoy the first two games, but something that's weird and unlike most franchises, I've actually enjoyed each release more than the previous one. The first game overall was pretty good, but some things like enemy AI, it was just terrible, as they would just charge at me like zombies. A lot of the clunkiness in the movement is also much improved over previous releases in the series, even though a lot of things still feel slower or delayed when compared to other shooters. In my opinion, it's much better than it used to be. And please don't hate me for this, but it's not just an evolution in technology we're talking about here. When you look at contemporary releases to the previous games, the AI and controls always just felt like it was lagging behind the other games that came out at the same time. Something that I thought was really neat about this one was that it almost felt like the Walking Dead TV series, but maybe presented a little bit better. Anyway, to me, it just basically follows the same general concept. You've got a group of people trying to survive in the wasteland. They move from place to place, meeting different gangs and factions and their various colorful and interesting leaders, who of course they inevitably come into conflict with. As you travel to the different zones, the various environments will actually have a lot of variation, which I thought added so much to the experience. The weather and environmental effects in this game are also done really well, adding to the overall immersion, which the series is noted for. There's also a couple of DLC expansions for the game, The Tale of Two Colonels and Sam's Story. Personally, I thought Two Colonels was great. It's very interesting and a much more unique experience out of the two DLCs, but it is also pretty short. Sam's Story feels more like a continuation of the main game. It's really quite good as well, but I just didn't like it quite as much as Two Colonels. Overall, I really enjoyed this game. It's a shooter, but it doesn't lock itself into a specific style like most do. A lot of shooters are going to be taking place in a war zone or something like that, so the whole game just feels kind of the same, and you keep moving forward. In this one, the story feels just so much more important, and it moves everything along, with the shooter aspects fitting nicely in between. That's also why, compared to Wolfenstein earlier, this is probably a style preference or a bias, but I really prefer this kind of shooter over the more generic shooter campaigns that take place in a battlefield or a war zone. To me, those kind of games always just feel like that mainstream big budget action movie that, don't get me wrong, it can be a lot of fun, but they never seem to have that lasting impression for me. With those kind of movies or games, you just sit down and kill some time. You turn off your brain and get entertained. With games like Metro, yes, they are shooters, but they're not that. You can get really immersed in what you're doing, you get a strong story being told, you get some great interpersonal interactions and struggles, and you still get your entertaining shooter with all of that. Like I said though, it's totally down to personal preference, and I'm not here to shame people who prefer the other types of games. It's just my opinion and how I feel about them. I would say Metro Exodus is a great choice if you enjoy shooters and want some really good story to go along with it. So I hope you enjoyed this look at Metro Exodus. Have you already played through this game? What were your own thoughts on it? Let me know down in the comments if you agreed with my own opinion and if you personally enjoyed this game. As always, if you found the video helpful or entertaining, please show it by giving the video a like and consider subscribing to the channel. I make and upload a variety of gaming content, not just reviews like this, but also walkthroughs, strategies, let's play and more. And I'd love to have you join the community and help direct the future of the channel. Otherwise, thank you so much for taking the time to watch today, and until next time, take care.
I still remember life before the war. I remember that we used to be different. Used to live up there, on the surface. We used to be the masters of the whole world. We built gigantic cities of glass and steel. We crossed the oceans at will. And we also conquered the skies. There used to be 7 billion of us. We were not born for life in the tunnels. I was born to breathe fresh air, and I remember it.